hope you're all doing well through this, as I say, I feel repeatedly challenging time. I'm honored to actually have all of you join us for today's important discussion on race and storytelling. It's an ongoing conversation, and if you recall, just a few weeks ago, we brought you a conversation on Black voices. And so today, we're here to focus on Asian American voices, because this too is a conversation that has been ongoing in the entertainment industry for years, but it has never been more timely, absolutely never been more timely, given some of the happenings in the world right now. So our goal in bringing these thought-provoking panels is to foster open and honest dialogue that will hopefully open minds and create meaningful, lasting change, because change is the only way for us to move forward. So as I said before, change isn't given, it is fought for. Sometimes it's fought for incrementally, and as we're seeing now, sometimes boldly. It's happening in our homes or on the streets, on social media, and sometimes in boardrooms and on sets. So we've aligned a fantastic set of panelists whom we've invited today to help us look at the way the world is changing and to amplify the voices and experiences of Asian Americans in the entertainment and media industry. Now, as with our first event in our Race and Storytelling series, our hope is to have an urgent and candid conversation with our guests about the systemic biases in our own front yard, to be inclusive of and address the intersectionalities that may include gender, age, disability, LGBTQ status, and to answer some of your questions along the way. So SAG-AFTRA is involved in promoting diversity at all times, equal employment, non-discrimination, but we know that there is so much more to do, and our member diversity committees and the Equity and Inclusion Department continue to ensure that the concerns of many communities are being heard by the union. We are actively listening. I want you to know, actively listening and engaged to be a part of the solution. So before we get started, I just want to thank our Executive Vice President, Rebecca Damon, for being here, our SAG-AFTRA Secretary Treasurer, Cameron Manheim, and our National Executive Director, David White, for being here as well, being a part of this conversation. You're going to hear actually from David directly in just a moment. I just want to let you know that I'll be leaving during the program to attend a previously scheduled meeting on COVID-19 and work safety. So now to kick off today's webinar, we have something really, really special and very close to our hearts to share with you. We are about to actually premiere our new PSA featuring SAG-AFTRA members calling on all Americans to stand against the stigma, xenophobia, and harassment so many Asian Americans are still experiencing as our nation grapples with COVID-19. It's unbelievable, it's unacceptable, and this is a very important message that's being put forward. So before I share that, I would like to acknowledge our National Vice President, Clyde Kusatsu. Hi, Clyde. And thank you for being here. Our National Asian Pacific American Media Committee Chair, Ren Hanami. Hi, Ren. Our Vice Chairs, Nick Sakai and Sheila Ivy Traster, for their incredible, really incredible, undying support and driving commitment to make this video a reality. You are all heroes. We also want to thank our members who volunteered their time to help to create this really wonderful message. That's Amy Hill, Carrie-Ann Inaba, Christina Chong, Clyde Kusatsu, Hudson Yang, Iqbal Thiba, Jeannie Mai, National Board Member Jody Long, Joel De La Fuente, John Briones, Juju Chang, James Hong, and Ken Jong, and Lucy Liu, Tai Ma, and Vincent Rodriguez III. And with all that being said, I would love you to see the video, but before you do, just remember this, we are on Zoom, so sometimes technology in Zoom and showing videos is not always clear. I hope it is, and I hope that you really will see, be able to see it in all of its greatness. Thank you.
We're living at a time when humanity matters most. Even though we're physically apart, we must all come together as one.
Yes, we're worried about our health, our loved ones, job prospects, our nation.
It's a scary time, but we can't let fear turn into hate.
Far too many people are using this crisis as an excuse to forget reason and embrace racism.
Asian Americans have been the victims of verbal and physical harassment during the COVID-19 pandemic.
Law enforcement has recorded a surge in hate crimes aimed at our community.
Families have been shunned, businesses vandalized.
People attacked on public transportation and children bullied and called hurtful names.
Can you imagine what it's like to face this kind of behavior at a time like this? That's what many of us across America are dealing with during this crisis.
And the number of incidents, they will rise, I'm afraid so.
We must all stop the stigma. We must all stop the xenophobia. We must all stop the hate.
This crisis has revealed some of our strengths.
Communities virtually coming together to raise money, feed people, lift spirits up.
So let's make sure ending this behavior becomes one of our strengths. Stand up against racism when we see it.
Support local Asian American business owners. Take care of your neighbors. We will get through this with empathy, care, and love of our fellow man, woman, and child.
As members of SAG-AFTRA and as Americans, we know our strength is in our diversity. We are always
stronger
together.
Fabulous is that. And now please welcome our National Executive Director, David White.
Thank you, Gabrielle, and hello to everyone. Just want to make sure you can hear me.
Yes.
Right, of course, this is the time where I'm having spectrum technology issues. Let's hope that gets fixed soon. I just want to say welcome to all of you. We have such a terrific panel that is planned this morning and afternoon, depending on where you are, on such an incredibly important topic. It is hard enough every day outside of a pandemic for us to have storytelling that showcases the full three-dimensional life and culture of each one of the groups within our community, and in particular here, Asian Americans. In the pandemic, where we've got leadership from the very top of our government making statements that follow blatant stereotyping and that deliver hate and vitriol, this conversation that we're having and the focus on what we can be doing as an industry and as a community to fight against that and to make sure that we have full portrayals of members of our community is really critical. So I'm very happy. I love the video that we just saw. I'm very happy, very pleased that we are presenting these conversations. The last one that we had for Black Americans was very powerful, and I'm anticipating this one to be very powerful as well. So really appreciate everyone being here. President Carteris, thanks for your leadership on this, and looking forward to the panel.
Thank you, David. It's going to be a great panel. So now for today's program, I'm really excited to welcome our moderator, Jeff Yang. Jeff is a featured contributor for CNN, a columnist for the South China Morning Post Inkstone magazine, and actually can be regularly heard both on NPR, love NPR, and on his podcast with Phil Yu, They Call Us Bruce. He founded A Magazine, the pioneering Asian American publication, and ran it as editor and publisher for over a decade, growing it to the largest such periodical in North America. And over the course of that time, he actually established himself as an outspoken leader in the Asian American community, a major organizer and a fundraiser for social and political causes, and a cultural influencer with a potent reach on digital platforms. He is the father of two sons, beautiful sons, Hudson and Skylar. Hudson, the elder, played the role of Eddie for 6 seasons in the groundbreaking ABC family sitcom, Fresh Off the Boat, who we also have here with us today. So ladies and gentlemen, without further ado, Jeff Yang.
Thank you so much, Gabrielle. And thank you, Ellen, Rebecca, the APAM committee, and the entire leadership of SAG-AFTRA for letting us talk about this incredibly critical topic. And just to remind us continuously that it's always classy to fight for equality. I am mindful of the fact that just maybe even a few months ago, it feels like, having a panel called Race and Storytelling might have been controversial. There might have been pushback on the idea that identity and culture and heritage shape the way that we as storytellers tell our stories and the kinds of stories we choose to tell. Things are different now, and they will continue to change with the unity we see here, with the leadership we've seen in this organization, but we need to keep on pushing it. And fortunately, we have a fantastic panel here to talk about how we're going to do just that. I'm going to introduce our panelists in brief, and then we're going to jump right into this. I, of course, encourage all of you to, if you have questions, share them in the YouTube stream, and we will answer them both during the actual course of the conversation and towards the end. I'm going to begin by introducing someone who I think for all of you needs no introduction, and that would be Clyde Kusatsu, who, of course, was in the first ever network series featuring Asian American family, All American Girl, opposite Margaret Cho, Jodie Long, and Amy Hill. He's perhaps best known for playing Colonel Key in the original Magnum PI series and has recurred on a wide range of different shows. But of course, as far as SAG-AFTRA, after the merger in 2012, Clyde was the first elected president of the Los Angeles local in 2013, and after at the SAG-AFTRA convention was elected the first national vice president, Los Angeles, an office he currently holds, having been reelected in 2019. Of course, he continues to perform and to be a outspoken and prized voice in our community. I next want to introduce Christina Chang, who is originally from Taipei, Taiwan, and moved to the US at age 17 to study theater and film. She's currently playing Dr. Audrey Lim on ABC's #1 drama series, The Good Doctor. We're all big fans in our household. And she will co-star soon in the independent film Press Play, to be released in 2021. Fingers crossed. Other credits include Guiding Light, As the World Turns, a full range of other roles that she has played. She speaks fluent Mandarin, which certainly one-ups me, and has studied trapeze, two-ups me, and lives in Los Angeles. And then Juju Chang, who is an Emmy Award-winning co-anchor of ABC News' Nightline. She also reports regularly for Good Morning America in 2020. She's been recognized for in-depth interviews, including transgender soldier Chelsea Manning, ex-firefighter Pat Hardison, after he received a groundbreaking face transplant. She continues to anchor a special edition of Nightline, Consent on Campus, which tackled complex issues surrounding sexual assault. And of course, she has profiled former Vice President and current presidential candidate Joe Biden, Oprah Winfrey, and many entertainers. Her very first job on air was reporting for KGO TV in San Francisco. And of course, Juju has been recognized with a wide array of awards, including multiple Emmys, Gracies, and so on and so forth. Next, I want to introduce Parvesh Cheena, an actor originally from Chicago. He recurred on Crazy Ex-Girlfriend and All Rise, voices characters on animated programs, including TOTS, The Rocketeer, and Mirror Royal Detective, with an all-South Asian cast, and is looking forward to acting on stage. That's whenever, of course, we can all be on stage together again. Other TV and film credits include Outsourced, Transformers, Rescue Bots, and Barbershop. And then Leslie Wu, a casting director nominated for 3 Primetime Emmy Awards for her work casting HBO's Silicon Valley, nominated for a CSA Artios Award for The Farewell, directed by Lulu Wang, and starring Awkwafina and Tai Ma. Other notable movie credits include Sonic the Hedgehog, Office Christmas Party, Togo, and The Half of It. And she just finished casting Bill and Ted Face the Music with Keanu Reeves, and the Netflix film Finding Ohana, about 2 siblings from Brooklyn reconnecting with their Hawaiian heritage. And she's also from Chicago. She and Parv have that in common. Last, but definitely not least, I'd like to introduce Hudson Yang, who I know quite well because he is in fact my son. If Clyde was the part of the first Asian American family on Primetime Network TV, Hudson was of course part of the most recent. As a cast member of Fresh Off the Boat, he was named by Variety and The Wrap as a rising star to watch in young Hollywood. During his 6 years as irrepressible protagonist Eddie Huang on Fresh Off the Boat, his performance garnered him multiple NAACP Image Award and Teen Choice Award nominations. For all of you who are here with us, both watching and of course participating on this panel, thank you so much for gathering on this morning or afternoon, depending where you are. We have a great conversation ahead of us, and I'm going to begin actually with Clyde to talk a little bit about the PSA that we just saw. What was it really that led SAG-AFTRA to feel like it was necessary to take this particular stand on anti-racism and to make this PSA?
Well, what happened was that the fact that the COVID pandemic was beginning, and then there was harsh reaction against Asians because it was being associated with Asia, China, China and with Kung Flu and all those dog whistles that go back to Asian Americans. We've been used to that since, gosh, in the 1840s with the Chinese coming to United States to build the railroads, work the gold mines, later the Japanese, the Filipinos. There was always those dog whistles. We were different. So it's happening again. It hasn't stopped. As far as when I was first born and grew up in Honolulu, we got a good lesson of what our place was, quote, within the plantation society that was in Honolulu at the time, or Hawaii. And you learned those codes. You learned how do you survive that? And my way of surviving was to try to embrace as much of Americana as possible and prove that I'm not the other, but I deserve to be here. So that being said, I was approached by Stephen Park, original Living Color actor, and also in French Dispatches, a new film to be released, possibly Wes Anderson film next year. And he said, what are we doing about that? And so as I'm in service to our fellow actors and to our union, I approached leadership at SAG-AFTRA and said, what are we doing? And thus began the role of the ball going down along the line. Eventually, Ren Hanami, Sheila Traster, Nick Sakai of APAM, the National Committee for Asian Americans Performers, was also brought in for their input and ideas. And it grew from there. And we settled on the idea of trying to recruit as many faces that people were familiar with, to just send messages in a coherent way so that people would understand what we're doing. And I think we hit a roadblock because all of a sudden it was the riots and Black Lives Matter and all those things. So we finally have a point so that we can launch it and start this conversation now to the rest of the country, and to provide other people's what our stories are like and how we are part of the American scene. Because I'd like to also say that, you know, and many times the Asians and Asian Americans are considered, well, the other. And it's like, I like to say the rainbow is not monochromatic. There's a lot of pigments in this rainbow. And we have to be also acknowledged. And Asians being Asians, we kind of tend to be quiet and to be humble or whatever, and the heck with that. Now, because that's not the American way, babe. I mean, we are here to express ourselves, to tell our histories. And at a young age, I learned at a long time that I developed it by, I had to study history so that I could be beyond that hurtful. But I deserve to be here. It's like not many people realize that the oldest Asian presence in the United States were the Philippines. From the Philippines, there were sailors. Spain had the Philippines for 350 years. A lot of the sailors were Filipinos. A lot of them jumped ship at Acapulco, made their way up to the Louisiana Territory in a place called Barataria Bay, just what is now known in New Orleans. And there was a pirate named Jean Lafitte in the late 1600s, the late 1700s, early 1800s. And he had a pirate navy of 3 ships, and there were about 600 to 700 Filipino sailors. So when Andy Jackson needed to ally himself to fight the British at the Battle of New Orleans in 1812, guess who was there on the front lines with Andy Jackson to defeat the British? Philippine sailors there. So when you do that, it stops people. They go, what? I didn't know that. Of course you didn't, because you're not taught that. We're not taught that. I'm taught that I have to be my own advocate. And I think I'm taking too much time here, so I turn it over to you.
I love that history lesson, because I did not know that myself. Certainly not about Filipino-American sailors or Filipino sailors fighting alongside Andrew Jackson in that war. But it really reminds us that history is what we tell. History is the stories we create. And I actually want to turn to Juju to ask, as a journalist, as a newswoman, the stories that are being told right now, the ways in which we are being framed, not just in the entertainment that we imagine, but the news that actually is coming out of our communities. How do you, as an Asian American journalist, essentially have the power to shape that And what inspired you to take part in this PSA as well?
Those are profound questions. Thank you, Jeff. And all I'm wondering is, where are you sitting in relation to Hudson in your house? But I digress. So happy to be here. I think as a nonfiction storyteller, as the AFTRA side of our union, there are many ways in which where I sit has shaped our storytelling. And I think that part of it, I will bring out, you know, we cast experts when we do stories. And so we look for experts of color, as well as, you know, going to the, you know, usual suspects, the white male talking heads that you so often see. That's part of it. I also think casting characters that we see as people of color, as three-dimensional people of color, whose stories we tell is an important part of it. But right now, I think what we're looking at is, you know, a re-examination of the power structure in our country, right? So in every media institution, we're looking at who holds the power, who's in the room to greenlight projects, who's in the room to say yes to the stories that we're going to tell, which stories are we going to tell, from what perspective are we going to tell those stories. And I think that's, you know, something that is true of nonfiction storytelling, as well as the entertainment side of this as well. Right now, I feel like we're in the midst of, you know, I've been a broadcast journalist for 30 years, and we're in the midst of the intersectionality, if you will, of COVID and George Floyd and the racial unrest. And I think that they are related, right? I mean, we have done weeks and weeks and weeks of reporting on the anti-Asian bias that has come out that Clyde referred to. There was a group that has been formed that we should all know about called Stop AAPI Hate. A group of organizations started tallying anti-Asian bias, and they tallied 1,500 cases like that. And those were cases of racism, hate speech, discrimination, and physical assaults, right? And at the same time, we saw the COVID divide that was so stark with regard to low-income communities, Black and Brown communities, but also Asian American communities. And I think that was something that needed to come out. This idea that, for example, in San Francisco, even though Asian Americans comprise, I wrote down the number so I could share it with you, they comprise a high percentage, something like 38% of the population. They represented 50% of COVID deaths, so a disproportionate share. And that had to do with all the same reasons why Black and Brown communities are disproportionately affected. So those are issues that we need to examine. And then when we get into the George Floyd and the racial inequity, I think it flows out of that feeling of there are these attacks on immigrant communities. There are attacks that are underway that we need to be mindful of. And I think that what we're doing now is re-examining the ways in which we tell these stories, the people who tell these stories, and the power structure behind all of it.
I think that one of the things that your statement really highlights is the fact that deciding what stories should be told is a form of editing. And we all know as storytellers how important editing is. If people decide that a story is worth telling, if it's elevated, if it's put on air, if it's put on screen, then it becomes something that everybody takes part in and is aware of. But the fact is, without people who see those stories as valuable at decision-making levels, you don't get those stories elevated. And this has been a really interesting time for Asian Americans. I'm going to turn it now to some of our Asian American performers to talk about the moment that we have been in. Really, right before the onset of COVID, we were seeing kind of an efflorescence, a blooming of Asian American stories on screen. I want to turn actually to Hudson Yang to talk a little about this. As somebody who was on Fresh Off the Boat, one of the first shows to really center an Asian American family since All American Girl, how did it feel to see yourself on screen, first of all, and to be in a position where you could elevate a different kind of family in people's primetime view for the first time in well over a decade?
Well, I think in the beginning, I didn't think too much of it. I mean, I was young. I was like 9 years old or something. But I think especially with your influence and like just people
Wasn't
telling me a
asking for
lot.
that.
Yeah, no, but no, I mean like you were talking to me a lot about the importance of the show, and I was getting like information from like different interviews and news sites, and I kind of slowly learned how much the show affected not only me but also the Asian community. And at that point, when I really realized how important the show was, I was honored. I mean, when I first got into acting, I never expected to really be part of anything, let alone the first Asian American family in 20 years on TV. And I didn't really know what to do with myself. I didn't know what kind of power I held or what kind of voice I had. And I've been doing my best to try to, spread the word and use my platform as a platform for other people's voices. But, it's a little bit difficult, and I'm still trying to kind of figure out what I can do best. So.
Well, one of the things that Fresh Off the Boat did was to normalize the idea that a family could be Asian American, that Asian Americans can speak English, that we have the same kinds of challenges and complex relationships and dynamics as everybody else. And that notion of normalization is so much a part of making us comfortable to others in society, not seen as others. I want to ask now, Christina, one of the things that has always shocked me is how few Asian faces there are as medical professionals on TV and in film, when we all know that's not how it is in real life. So in your role as Dr. Lim on The Good Doctor, I mean, first of all, it's one of the most diverse shows on TV, and the characters themselves defy the very stereotypes that we often see, even when we are included, are ourselves depicted as. What are some of the things that actually allowed that kind of storytelling to happen within The Good Doctor?
Well, hello. First of all, I'm honored to join you. Thank you very much, everybody. And before I forget, and I will get to your question, but just in listening to everyone previous, I'm hearing sort of this theme of striking a balance, and this is something that I'm currently and sort of have always been straddling. So maybe we can touch on this later. But this idea of like assimilation or normalization versus individuating, and I think that tends to be our particular struggle as Asian Americans. How do you stand out but then fit in? So if we can talk about that later. How did we get there? So for this, our particular show, The Good Doctor, I think this is largely due in part to Daniel Dae Kim and his, Sebastian and David brought it from Korea, Sebastian Lee and David Kim, and then they joined forces with Daniel. And it really was Daniel's, he was motivated, obviously, for, personal and professional reasons, but it was, on top of it being a Korean-based show, it was his, it was important for him to see more faces like ours on camera. And that's not to take anything away from ABC and Sony. There was an openness there, obviously, to have more than just one Asian face. And I think Sandra Oh has said this in the past, and I think we all agree that it's so rare to work with a fellow Asian American, because so much of my career for the past 20 years has been I'm the only one on the show. And so I cannot tell you how great it felt to work alongside Tamlin and Will Yun Lee when we first began, But now then we have to talk about diversity and inclusion and what that really means. And I think it's really nice to see the United Colors of Benetton sprinkled on television. And it's a step forward. And then you have to do sort of a deeper dive into, okay, but then how diverse are you? Who are you supported by? Who's creating these storylines? How authentic is that? And then to what we've spoken about already, the people that are in the positions to cast, to the decision makers that allow these stories to be told and then decide who gets cast and who gets paid and how they get paid. That's where the movement needs to keep going. Do you know what I mean? Yeah. So that's, I don't know if I answered the question.
Oh, no, you absolutely did.
Spoke on, yeah.
No, that was fantastic. And I think actually you not only answered the question, but provided a very nice segue, because I wanted to ask about the role of casting in how we bring more complex and more nuanced portrayals to life. to your point, normalization is not enough. Having normal people on screen is kind of boring. What you want is different, interesting, unique, idiosyncratic people. And Leslie Wu, as a casting director and somebody who's cast some of the most idiosyncratic and interesting casts that we've seen on film and television, let's talk a little bit about that. How do you sort of stretch the idea of what it means to be Asian American on screen beyond simply being Asian American on screen? And how does casting actually play a critical role for that?
Well, I think that we've been really fortunate in the last several years to have stories that do focus on individual stories, like Christine was saying, is that it's not just about having a face in there to satisfy, the quotient, and it's more about focusing on the individual's journey, this character's journey. I think, the success of The Farewell and the half of it were due to the fact that they concentrated on this one person, on their personal journeys, their obstacles that they had to face. And, they happened to be Asian. And so I think it's not, I think that casting directors, I know a lot of my colleagues for many, many years have strived to be more inclusive, to have diversity on the screen. But it can only, we get to a certain point where we can send, a link of 80% minorities, and then the final choice is still not that. So I think that the more stories that there are that focus on individual journeys are the key to, bringing about these stories, on screen. I think that comes down, like a lot of what Juju was saying, it comes down from the top. I've worked with 4 female Asian directors in the last year and a half, which I could never, if you had asked me 10 years ago, I would have said that would never have happened. But that is because there is now an openness to hearing these stories, to hearing different perspectives. I recently had a relatively heated discussion with a friend who has been living in a red state for a while now. And, it was, the question was posed like, well, what's the point? What's the point of all this? And it's like, if he's saying, if I'm never going to understand what it's like to be in a certain person's shoes, what's the point? Well, the point is to understand each individual's perspective, understand their experiences, their history, where it comes from as people, aside from race, gender, sexuality, whatnot. So I think that, the more opportunities, the more scripts there are, the more pitch meetings there are with Asians going in and talking to the execs and telling them, their histories. It ranges. I think we can very easily group Asians into one race, but then there are so many stories, the variance between everybody's experiences. I have friends that grew up in gangland, and compared to a very lofty suburban experience, So I think that all of those stories coming to fruition, having the ability to put those into production and then put those on screen, that allows us as casting directors to find not just Asian actors, but the Asian actors who are right for this, the Asian actors who fit that storyline, who understand that perspective, who have had, similarities with that. And so, yeah, I think it definitely comes from the top down.
Clyde, I want to throw to you since you have something to add, I'm sure.
I want to say a shout out to the casting directors, because in my 47 years in front of this camera, it took casting directors to think outside the box. And a lot of my experience was being called in for an audition for a cop, a lawyer, a judge, a doctor, and showing up at the interview and there'd be Hispanic, a Black, myself, and a smattering. And it was like, oh, and they said, they asked for good actors. So I'm bringing in good actors. And that's how I got a foothold in it. I'll tell you a brief story. I am a theater major, graduated from the Northwestern University Theater Department. And when I came out to LA, I think I was maybe one or two Asian Americans that happened to be blessed with training as an actor. And my first show was Kung Fu. And then after I did that one, I must have hit a button, because my next interview for Kung Fu, those were the days when you could go in, you were not one and done. You had an opportunity throughout the whole arc of a series to be brought in for a different role, different characters. And I walked in and the casting director said, quick, come with me. He led me down the hallway and he opened the door and said, hey, this is the guy I was telling you about. He can talk. Because back in the day, in the 70s, they would cast to the type and what they thought it was great. But then they couldn't act. So they would put in the dialogue later called looping. And so it was no wonder they said Asians can't act, because everybody was so bloody stiff. And the whole thing about nuance and everything about that, you have to know about the history. So second show I ever did on Kung Fu, I got a guest star part. And it was great. The directors then said, hey, you're too American sounding. Can you give us an accent? And that's when the days were like, are you fight or you flight? And I went, paused, and I went, okay. I used the dialogue I learned in Northwestern, stage diction. Why Chang Kane? We, the member of the songs, feel that you, and then after the cut, he said, that's it, because you gave them something different to their ear. And that's the whole process. I've discovered it because when I was in when I came to LA in 71, we're the only ones here. You know, you could count the amount of actors of like 10 on your hands. And it takes perseverance, patience, and grit, and to be not too sensitive, be strong enough to just handle it. And you make steps by steps, and then you build a reputation. And if you're looking for actors who can act, you wind up getting the start. And I think it's great in today's world that we have a plethora of Asian American talent from Asia and from here, to the point where it's really kind of, in a way, ironic, because back in the 70s, 80s, 90s, whenever there was a role, I would get sent in. But now it's dependent upon, no, we're going to go to Hong Kong, we're going to go to Korea or Malaysia, because they've got a fan base and there's a marketplace there. So it's being driven by that as well. And then we can also PR the whole thing that they have a little bit more standing. You know, the Asian American actor has always had to be pushing that stone up the mountain, and you can never let go, because that stone's going to come down and crush you. And you sort of like, you really have to be, and also I think for me, what I learned how to do is to be quick-witted and tap dance. And the historical things come to my mind, because you can also break that ice by saying, oh yeah, well, did you know that in Mississippi, there are several generations of Chinese that were brought in over after the Civil War to be the labor replacements until the KKK got active and put everybody back, but they just dumped them in. Those were the Delta Chinese. And I remember meeting an actress named Virginia Wayne, and when she talks, she had a thick Southern accent. And I take it back to you there, Jeff. You'll take it over now.
Thank you. That is something actually to remember, that we don't all speak the same way. And in fact, our voices are a critical way in which people sometimes read us, right? I will tell you, Hudson Yang cannot do accents, not because he's not a good actor, he just doesn't have it in his vocal range. But the voice acting component of our community is really critical. I want to turn this over to Parv, because I know you've done a lot of really exceptional voice acting recently. And that's a space in which we've seen some transformative change recently. Notably, the push now to really have Asian American talent do Asian American roles, to do appropriate voices for appropriate faces, if you will, in a part of the industry where that's not necessarily required. Parv, what is it about, I think, voice acting that both gives opportunity for Asian American actors, and in particular, in the kinds of stories you're telling, how does being an Asian American actor doing an Asian American role in an animated series change that part?
Well, hi everybody. The voiceover community is just such a rich and joyful place to be as an actor, because before we even started getting into like, ethnic casting accuracy in a sense that we've seen on camera, because you can't hide this sometimes. Like when they call for a certain ethnicity from a time period to be, this is what you're going to get. When I'm playing a rock or a cloud or a dragon or the idea, like we can play such conceptual things in voiceover. But in recent years, Disney, Nickelodeon, everybody, if it is a brown or Asian or Latinx character, they really want to now cast it. Even just a few years ago, they were still casting Caucasian for Indian American specific people. And the reverse does happen, on Rocketeer, I was grateful, like it was just a Caucasian character, because they also there is some sensitivity at times where they want to overcompensate. We've seen that too. We're like, oh, well, Pravesh is Indian in real life, Indian American. We should make the character brown. We're like, well, it's just a bird. You don't have to change the pigment on this bird, right?
It's a brown bird.
We see this hypersensitivity sometimes, and a little bit of what Clyde was saying about, that rock up the hill. Thank you, Northwestern, my Chicago friend. Clyde never will ever back down to let you know he went to Northwestern. I went to Roosevelt University. Okay, sorry. Definitely. But what he was saying is that we just have this like pressure sometimes to be every Asian, every story. I think Christina talked about this too and hinted at it, like where sometimes we have to be able to say like, this is just our story, or this is just mine. I can't speak for everyone else, So voiceover has been fun because we've just been able to it's another big, huge market that we can get in. I'm very grateful to Mirror Royal Detective, which is on Disney right now, because it is the first fully South Asian cast. And even specifically about where we are in the time, in our timeline, like 2020 is a lot different than 2004 when I moved here from Chicago, where they don't want any accents. What your natural accent is what your character will be. So when Sonal Shah and I play bandits, we're just a little hyper version of our Chicago suburban. But when Iqbal Thiba comes in, or or Mother Joffrey, they just get to be themselves. So we're finding it, I think, all together, and it's just been, for me, I'm just very grateful that it pays the bills. It pays my rent.
Juju, I think you had something to say.
I was just going to talk a little bit about why we all know on this panel why representation matters. But I was reading George Takei's Instagram the other day, and he said representation matters not so that every kid sees themselves reflected as a hero on the story, but that every other kid sees other kinds of heroes reflected on the scene. And I think through all the people I've interviewed, Mindy Kaling being one of them. She was on the Wrinkle in Time, right? Which was Oprah Winfrey, Reese Witherspoon, Mindy Kaling, directed by Ava DuVernay. And they all talked about being content creators. And Mindy Kaling said to me, I didn't see characters like myself reflected on the screen, so I wrote it myself. And so in this moment of pandemic where so many of these creatives are at home, I would urge you to create the content that you wish to see out there. And then moving beyond that, I would say there's also this need, and Leslie, I'd be curious what you think about this, to cast sort of in a post-racial way. I interviewed Shonda Rhimes in Shondaland, and she said, my characters were not Black doctors. They were doctors who happened to be Black. And the storylines weren't just about their Blackness. It was about their sex lives and their, interior lives and their struggles and their insecurities. And the racial part of it was actually in the background. If you really go back and look at Grey's Anatomy, there weren't a lot of issues. And yet, the lead doctor was African-American. Prominent people in that hospital were three-dimensionally happened to be African-American. And I think once we get to that, once we cast characters that aren't written as Asian-American, but just as human, that are then cast as Asian-American, there's that dual role where you want to write the incredibly intense Asian-American role and play it and be it, but then you also want to sort of ignore that and move on to where we're just exploring our common humanity.
Christina, I wanted to go to you.
Thank you. And thank you for saying that, Juju, because I think that's sort of what I was hinting at before when I was saying, this is something that's, and I don't know if it's a hope or a concern or a question. I throw this back out to everybody, but so that's one of the things that I, in speaking with Will, my cast member, William Lee, we said it's actually really nice to play doctors and residents that that are struggling at their job or succeeding at their job, and what they look like has very little to do with what's happening on the show. And at the same time, and by the way, I think, and this is sort of ties in with sort of what we were, the PSA and, and what you've just said, it's really nice to see people that look like us for all the children in the world to see. And so, and that's wonderful. And at the same time, how do we tell our individual stories and raise those up? There's so many unique stories that really are rooted in, like, what is the history, which Clyde could probably tell us, take a master class in the history of this country. And then also the thing that I sort of want to talk about is the, if we like the I think we sort of equate American, or not we, but some equate American with Caucasian. And so, how do we, seeing faces like this and letting all those kids see us as doctors with sex lives, or, just moving about the world, does that help others to see us as American? Do you see what I'm saying? And so then that takes the stigma away from the Chinese virus. I mean, so this conversation, I think, is constantly one that I'm having with others and within myself. And it's important to, I don't even want to say assimilate, but that's what's being told by, to us by immigrant parents. And, how do you keep uniquely who you are, right? And tell your stories, by the way, Juju, and have them, I'm bringing up 17 points and then I'll shut up. But, how do you tell your stories and create the content, which I am with a fellow Eurasian friend and actress? How do we create that and get that seen if the people in the positions of being decision makers don't understand it and don't give us the space to do it, Okay, now shut up.
No, that's terrific. I think that one of the points that's being made multiple times during this conversation so far is that when we talk about diversity and inclusion, it shouldn't be considered a limitation. It's not that we want to get one in and stop. It's not that we see this as something which is a guardrail for creativity. It's really about the idea that when you have a multiplicity of ideas and cultures and stories represented on screen, they're free to be different. They're free to be more. I actually want to kick over to Hudson, because one of the things that I think was particularly special about Fresh Off the Boat is that even though you had, in many cases, screens full of Asian Americans, right? They were distinct and different, and in many cases running against character and type. And your role in particular, the role of Eddie Huang, based on a real life person, was a not particularly archetypal role for Asian Americans. It was an Asian American kid inspired by Black culture. So I wanted to ask you a little bit about that feeling, and especially the sense that a lot of the people who were watching you, to the point that George Takei made, that Juju shared, were not actually Asian American. That a lot of the people who've come up to you and said, hey, Fresh Off the Boat is my favorite show, are African American, are non-Asian.
Mm-hmm.
Hudson.
Yeah, what about it?
Just, share a little bit more about how different it is in some ways, to have played a role in which, you're not just recognized among Asian American communities, but among other communities as well.
I mean, I still do think that a very large portion of the people watching were Asian American, but it's not like it doesn't make sense that there were still like white and African American and other races that still enjoy the show. It was a show about a immigrant family, and I think any family that has an immigrant in their family or did immigrate, or is like just immigrants in general will understand and relate to it, and it's just about family dynamics. I think it goes to show that it's not about an Asian American family, it's just about a normal family, and anyone who has a family understands like what a family is like, or has a mom or whatever, can relate to the kind of like things that are going on in the show and the jokes and the whatnot.
I think that's an interesting point there too, that, in some ways specificity is universality, right? That when you actually dive into the heart of a story like that of an immigrant family, we find connection points that all of us, whether we're Asian or not, or even whether we're immigrant or not, that we can connect to. I'm going to toss that over to Leslie to share a point, and then I think we have some questions from the audience we want to actually bring up as well. That notion of especially universality and specificity, Leslie.
Yeah, I was going back to what Juju and Christina were saying too. I think we are right now, just watching the progression of inclusivity over the last, 15 years. I've seen a lot of productions on the cusp of making so much effort to be inclusive and diverse, and that balancing that with colorblindness. And that's something where, going back to what Clyde was saying, is like, that is, I think, what so many casting directors try to do. Even if a role is written as a very specific race, you say, look, there's a side, unless there's a cultural aspect to it, there's not a need for this character to be this specific race. It's up to us to bring in all the people, all the great actors that we think that would be right for the role, and wanting in the end to have it be a balanced representation of our society, which we are such a mixed culture, and so I think there's a fine line that we're treading right at this very moment. And I do feel like being able to cast colorblind is the ultimate goal, where then it goes back to everybody seeing these individuals, these stories as their personal journeys, and being able to see people of all different races on screen in all different aspects.
So there's a question that's come in from the audience, actually, which I think really hits on one dimension of that notion of casting. I'm going to throw it to you, Leslie, and then actually Christina to follow up on it. But one of our viewers asked, she says she is half Vietnamese, half white. What are your thoughts about not being, quote unquote, Asian enough for a role when creative wants to include and have a diverse cast? And this notion of physical representation of heritage and so on and so forth, shaping the way that people see you, even within that context, is something which obviously is a challenge for casting. Leslie, how do you address that, and how do you actually ensure that those types of roles are filled in ways that are authentic to the parts, but also provide broad opportunity?
I mean, I think that those, I think whenever that situation arises, that's an opportunity for an in-depth conversation about what the world is. I have friends who are mixed race, but grew up their entire lives in Taiwan. They speak fluent Chinese. They know so much about the history and culture, as opposed to someone like me. I can kind of get by, I'm conversationally fluent, but I think that the appearance, that's kind of the thing again of going to the colorblindness of it all, is recognizing people for their talents and their qualities and their experiences. I have a friend who is Argentinian and English is her second language, but she also always gets passed up because she doesn't look Latina enough, and it's not, I think that with the way the world is right now, if we are to truly reflect what our communities are, what the different dynamics and the relationships are, different family makeups, I think that has to be something that's addressed in saying, look, there's someone, they may be mixed race, but they may also be completely imbued in the Vietnamese culture and speak fluently. And there needs to be conversations where there's an understanding where just because that doesn't fit what you have, in your mind aesthetically, that doesn't mean that that's not the case.
Christina, I wondered if you had some thoughts around that as well.
Sure. Being half Caucasian and growing up in Taiwan and being able to speak Mandarin, I'm one of those people that Leslie was just talking about that, when I came up, and actually I don't remember what the question was at the top part saying, not being seen as Asian enough. I'm assuming that's a casting thing that she's hearing, or from producers, and or maybe that's how she's feeling. I don't know. But It's tricky, and I'll just say that, you know, when I was coming up in the business, it was a little bit harder, you know, and I'm not going to take too much time to say this, but I was encouraged when I first graduated from graduate school, not at Northwestern, University of Washington, sorry, that I went to New York City and I was advised to change my last name and to take Kung Fu you know, lessons. I didn't do either of those things. I was told that my name together was not a marquee name. And I was like, well, I'm gonna make it one then. But the point being that, you know, whatever people's choices are, right? It's about what makes you feel good about pounding that pavement, how you are gonna be able to look in the mirror when you get that job or you don't get that job. And I would say the climate now is such that being a blended face, I guess, is so much more welcome and so much, it's just, and I hear that it's still hard if you don't, you know, pass for something or you could pass for that. Lots and lots of doors closed to me because I wasn't Caucasian fully and I wasn't Asian fully. And this brings up to me, quite frankly, this idea of this third culture kid, which I am, and that, you know, but you can look fully Caucasian and grow up in Asia and feel very tied to the Asian community and culture and come back to the States or go to Europe and feel out of place and feel like a third culture kid too. So it really is about your individual experiences. And I think that's when it comes into play, that it's interesting that we write our own stories and our own articles and or we put it up on YouTube or we, you know, however it gets put out there. And I think the more we move forward and, you know, the more third culture kid might even be eradicated and we'll just sort of all be one culture. I don't know.
Sometime many lifetimes from now, perhaps.
Perhaps.
But I want to now, on that point, you know, there's another question here that is an interesting one about how we actually address stereotypes, bullying, and so on and so forth, especially within the context of comedy. You know, there's a lot of times in which people will make a statement and say, oh, it's just a joke. Don't you have a sense of humor? I want to turn this to Parv and to Hudson. You know, both of you have been outspoken about bullying. Both of you have played comic roles. To just talk a little bit about how we as Asian Americans can use humor in some ways to push back around these things, and also at what times things just simply aren't funny. Parv first.
I've been debating with my sense of comedy. And again, my experience is that I grew up in the suburbs of Chicago. My suburb, Naperville, Aurora, that area, Wayne's World, is very white. And then the next biggest minority is Asian. Like, still to this day, you know, it's very similar to Santa Clarita in a sense. Typically conservative. They have gone blue, Lauren Underwood in Naperville, just like how, you know, Katie Hill was here in 2018. All this sensitivity, I realize, like with everything, like especially with respect to our trans and non-binary siblings, my own language usage has evolved and is changing and is growing. So I'm really questioning a lot of my comedy and humor in the last few years because I felt like mine was in service of the white majority. The white bullies who in high school into college were like, yeah, make fun of that. Be like, yeah, you guys like me now because we made fun of the other. You know, I feel like what Asian culture, a lot of our time, especially from our parents being immigrants here, we aligned ourselves with the majority because our parents, when my dad and mom got out of inner city Chicago to the burbs, because they were just told, like, that's where you go. You're one of the good ones. You know, I cannot be the only one who's heard that at my own high school graduation from parents' friends who I thought were like, just because they did have that perception. So I've been questioning a lot. I feel like where kids are today being more open, you know, Christina's hit on this, like this confusion. Like I spent so many years in my 20s doing the accent because let's not forget, there's a lot of similarities to what's happening to more of our East Asian friends with the Corona pandemic. That reminds me of like the 93 Gulf War when I was, you know, Latinx friends would be like, you look like Saddam Hussein, cut to, you know, I'm in college, 9/11. And that was even just like me being a gay musical theater kid in Chicago really shifted when I'm like, well, you really need to take out those piercings, Parv, and don't ever think about dyeing your hair or getting a tattoo because you are going to be playing the terrorist or at least someone traditional from India when we do a period piece. So I'm not, maybe not the best one to ask, because even my own sense of comedy of aligning with the majority to make, I always thought like, oh, self-deprecation, victim-y, lower status is my jam, you know? So I'm just really questioning a lot, because then I feel like I'm getting checked by kids when they were younger saying like, that was not all right, and that was not okay for you to go through or excuse. So it is very interesting. So I just hope that growing this beard lets me do hour-longs like Christina.
All right. Hudson, especially in a world of social media, there was a question also about TikTok and about Instagram and about the ways in which sometimes these platforms are used both to celebrate, but also sometimes to dismiss and shame, right? As a Gen Zer, as a kid of that generation, how do you address when especially people use those platforms to try to bully and to harm your self-perception?
I mean, I'm not necessarily on those social medias very often, but I feel like one thing is that people have been doing a good job of kind of doing that themselves. Like recently, like a bunch of people who've been like called out for using their platforms, using their popularity to kind of spread the wrong things and the wrong image and being a bad role model have been canceled, where like people online no longer really want to support them or follow them or watch them because of things they did in the past. And I think people have been doing a good job of kind of managing the kind of humor that's being spread on that platforms. Like, I mean, people did blackface on TikTok before, and it's incredibly racist and horrible, but because they did that, all the popularity that they gained was kind of like lost or tossed aside. But then, I mean, it's still not perfect. There's still people who are racist and awful. And I think it's really difficult to control people like that on those platforms because they're public and you can do whatever you want, post whatever you want. I mean, it's hard to control people. You can't really control people think. Even no matter how hard we try, there's also going to be some sort of discrimination to some sort of group of people. I think the best thing we can do is kind of what we've been doing now, getting rid of those and making an example of those who have made those mistakes, teaching people the hard way, not letting people go off with like a simple slap on the wrist. And I think people have become a little more aware of the issue. And I think that's one good thing that social media has done, is that people now kind of seem to understand a little better that what they did in the past isn't excusable. What they're doing now is even less excusable, right? If they haven't learned from their mistakes already, they don't deserve to get another chance. I think just, yeah.
That's powerful words. I want to throw a last question out to Juju and to Clyde. And this is about what we in our respective industries as storytellers can do to try to not just address anti-Asian bias, but also reach out and to form bonds of allyship with other communities to elevate not just our own boat, as it were, but the entire ocean. Juju, I know that you've been really prominently involved in working across communities of color and telling those stories. What are some of the ways that storytellers can do that, both push back against things happening in their own communities, but also reach out to others?
It's such a good question. But before I go forward, I just wanted to touch on what Hudson was saying on social media. I think a lot of what we're seeing too is calling out racist behavior on social media. You know, the Karens that are suddenly captured on surveillance cameras or iPhones, and there's another discussion that's happening. But Jeff, you're right. I think it's great to end on allyship, because I think our whole country is going through this discussion right now, having seen the COVID divide and having seen the George Floyd murder, that we want to be able to do something. We want to educate ourselves, we want to learn, and we want to be good allies. And I think that from a nonfiction storytelling perspective, I've done that throughout my career, you know, but also bringing my own perspective in. So for example, I came to this country as a 4-year-old immigrant from Korea, and I watched my father be emasculated by white male culture, and so I carry that within me, and so I find myself drawn to stories about migrants. So for example, we've done a whole series at Nightline about the immigration and the border policies, the border wall, the quotas, the Remain in Mexico policies. I did a story in December about pregnant women sleeping in camps on the other side because of the migrant protection protocols. So these are nonfiction stories that I'm drawn to, not because I'm Asian, but because I'm an immigrant, or because I'm a mother, or because I bring in a lot of different perspectives. And I think that's what allyship is. We know what it feels like to be marginalized, so we can see. I've done stories about trans women of color who have been under attack, that just won a GLAAD award, and just won a Gracie Award. And so these are nonfiction stories that I'm drawn to because I know what it means to be, to feel other, right? That you're not, where are you from? Because you're not from here. You're not American, is the implicit message of the messaging that we've had, the microaggressions that we've had. And Christina, the other thing I was thinking when you were talking is that I just interviewed Kevin Kwan, who wrote Sex and Vanity as a follow-up to Crazy Rich Asians trilogy. And Kevin's character in Sex and Vanity, main character, is a biracial Chinese American Lucy Tang Churchill, who is half High Wasp and half Asian American. And so there will be, and it's a full exploration of those two worlds and the intersection there. But you know, I think we're at a time where we're examining privilege, and someone described privilege as if you've never had a Supreme Court ruling decide whether your rights are equal to others, then you have privilege. And I think that we as allies can continue to tell the stories of those marginalized, whether it's to tell the stories of, you know, I profiled George Takei, so he keeps coming back to mind, but he wrote a book about his childhood experience in an internment camp. Right, he literally slept in the stables of the racetrack in Southern California when he was like my age as an immigrant, 4 or 5, and then was sent to an internment camp. And he wrote that and said, "But we have to remember our history. Otherwise, we're going to be repeating it." And he pointed to what he referred to as the children in cages and the migrant sort of policies that, in his mind, mirrored his own childhood experience. So, you know, I'm throwing in the kitchen sink on this particular answer, but I think that, there's a lot of history to be told, a lot of our perspectives to be brought forward that can link arms with other communities, and that really progress is about inclusion, not just seeing one particular person of color on screen.
You know, when you're talking about that sort of where are you from thing, right? I'm remembering now, I believe that you've actually spoken about this, and it refers to something that Christina also mentioned. I'm sure you get a lot of questions about Juju, your name, right? It's like, you know, where did that come from? How did you get named Juju? You know, and as a journalist especially, the choice to preserve that name and to embrace your identity and your on-screen credits, as it were, is something that kind of is a defiant challenge to people who would otherwise put you in a box.
And trust me, an executive once suggested, like Christina, like, well, maybe, you know, Juju. And I was like, yeah, no, I've been Juju since I was 10, and that's Juju. But, you know, I will tell you one last story. The other night, my nephew started in the Dodger game as the pitcher. His name is Mitchell White, speaking of half Asians. I want you all to become fans of Mitchell White of the Dodgers. But it occurred to me in the middle of the color commentary, the play-by-play announcer said, you know, Mitchell White, his grandfather on his mother's side was a Dodger fan. And I thought, that's it, what an immigrant story. Like, my father came to this country, had played baseball in Korea, and was a Dodger obsessed baseball fanatic his entire life. And he didn't live to see his grandson drafted by his favorite major league franchise. But when that announcer said it, literally like 20 Koreans in my family started crying, because it was such a culmination of you know, the immigrant dream. It was just, and right. And I know I put it on my Facebook, and I got I got comments from South Asians who were like, oh, go immigrants, you know, literally, you know, and again, it crosses color lines, it crosses, you know, it's, again, this is just a story we're telling about our background and our struggles and where we're coming from and where we hope to go to. And that's just the human experience.
Well, that ultimately is what we're talking about here, the human experience and trying to make it richer. And with that, I want to thank all of our panelists and all those who have tuned in. I'm mindful of time now, so I'm going to actually close things off and turn the mic back over to Rebecca Damon to close things off. And thank you guys again so much for participating.
Oh my gosh, Jeff, and all of the panelists, you guys were just amazing. This was a terrific panel. These are the kind of conversations that we need to be having. And it was said at the top that as SAG-AFTRA, we really do believe our strength lies in our diversity. And this was just, the conversation was so real and so touching. And Hudson, I see you looking down. I have one question for you before we go away here. So I just have a question for you. So be ready to go off mute. I want to say, did you think your dad did a good job moderating today? What do you think?
Well, first of all, I wasn't looking down. My camera just keeps on freezing for no reason. Like, I'll be like this for 1 second, then it freezes, and I look back up, and it's just still frozen. I can't fix it. So I wasn't looking down. But I think my dad did a good job. It was really weird for me to be interviewed by my dad.
I think he did a great job too, but I wanted to, you know, ask because it'll be dinner table conversation. There's no doubt in anybody's mind that you guys, the whole panel, and Jeff, what a great conversation. This is what we need to be doing. I want to make sure that everybody that's tuned in today also checks out the PSA online. So make sure you're following all the SAG-AFTRA social media channels. Please share it on everything, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. Just share it everywhere. We want to make sure people are seeing it. I want to also thank all of the people who helped put this together. Our National Vice President, Los Angeles, Clyde Kazatsu, bless you. And also to Ren Hanami. I know, the sneezes have to go on mute. Ren Hanami, who is the chair of APAM, along with her vice chairs, Sheila Ivy Traster and Nick Sakai, and all of the wonderful staff from APAM and Communications that helped get this done. So if you want to learn more, after you've shared that, I'm counting on everybody to share it today. Make sure you share that. You should make sure you follow us on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, etc., and come back and do some more of these President's Task Force of Education, Outreach, and Engagement, our panels and webinars on our Facebook channel on YouTube. And please subscribe on YouTube so you can see the next one. We're going to be doing more of these things. We may all be at home and apart, but really we get things done together. So thank you guys. It's so good to see you, and have a good rest of your day. Stay safe, everybody, and wear a mask. Let me see. Yes, I love it. Thank you, Parvi. Have a good one, guys. For SAG-AFTRA, we're signing out.